So in the 17th century, right, this new Qing dynasty is very powerful. It's able to conquer China and then continue into the 18th century to continue expanding, to bring peace and stability to China, which then allows for a great deal of prosperity. But remember, this class is focusing on the 19th century, particularly technically begins in 1850. And what we have to understand is that even though you had this glory days in the 18th century in the Qing, the 19th century was not so glorious. There are going to be lots of problems in the 19th century. And it's in the 19th century then when Qing China is facing all these difficulties that then it faces Western and then later Japanese imperialism. So they're having both domestic and foreign problems at the same time. So just keep that in mind. So the Qing enjoyed peace and prosperity, and that of course leads to population growth. When you have, especially in a pre-modern society or early modern society, population growth means things are good. People are getting enough food to eat, that they are surviving childhood, that they are surviving childbirth, and that they are surviving into old age. So by 1800, China had 300 million people. So that's pretty impressive. And between 1800 and 1850, it went up to 400 million. And the problem was, in that shift, you go from having enough enough open land or enough opportunities for labor that more people just means more stuff, right? When you have more land or when you can have more people work the same land and grow more food, population growth is fine because people are producing more food than they eat. But the problem is by 1850, there's no longer a lot of new land that's open. There is no longer a need for labor. Some land is almost overworked in a sense. And so what that means is that you're going to have less food for more people. Right. So when you have population growth and you have land and you have places for people to work, that's fine because people are going to produce more than they eat. But now there's less food for more people. And when you have limited resources, you're going to have more conflict over resources. So in China in the 19th century, there's a general increase in crime. Sometimes the criminals become organized very well, become bandits, and bandits are always dangerous because it's one step from being a bandit to being a rebel. And to give you an idea of how bad things become, infanticide becomes a huge issue in China. Infanticide means the killing of infants. Of course, this is a time period when abortion would have been extraordinarily dangerous. And so typically, in order to protect the life of the mother, if you had a child that the family did not think they could support, or typically because, I'll come back to that, then the baby would be born and then they would kill the baby shortly after birth. And that's what you see in this picture. They're not pouring water in the bucket to bathe the child. They're pouring water in the bucket in order to drown the child. The baby is born and then you put them headfirst in a bucket and then they drown. And another reason why they would, not only to protect the health of the mother, they would wait till the child was born. It was also often to check the gender. For various reasons that we won't go into here, males were preferred. And so if it was a male baby, sometimes they would allow the baby to live. If it was a girl, though, other times they would drown the child or kill them in another way. Now, this is, of course, what can I say? This is upsetting. But for our purposes, what we have to emphasize here is if you're in such poverty that you're killing your own babies, you can't feel that the emperor has the mandate of heaven. Remember, Chinese people are very practical. We know the emperor's doing a good job because we have enough food to eat, we have clothes to wear, and all that wonderful stuff. If we're killing our children because we can't make ends meet, there's a general feeling that something is wrong. And there really was something wrong. The government was not able to help people when there were disasters and famines. The government was often very inefficient in its response to those. So you put all this together, and many people are going to start questioning whether or not the Qing do in fact have the mandate of heaven. So keep in mind we have these serious domestic issues that Qing China is facing. Now, in the 18th century, more and more Europeans, and then starting with I believe in 1784, Americans are going to start coming to China looking for trade. In Europe and the growing United States, there's a belief that trade is good, that trade will make people wealthier, that we should encourage and support trade. However, China did not much trust trade. Qing China was not a huge fan of trade. While Europeans and Americans saw trade as something that should be encouraged, the Qing tended to see trade as something that should be at most tolerated. And you can kind of see this if you look at how the Chinese divided up society. The Chinese basically thought that there were four social classes: the officials, the scholars on top. They were the people who governed. Below them were the farmers. Everyone needs farmers. We need food to eat. There was a Chinese saying that the root, the foundation of all under heaven are the farmers, because without farmers, we can't live. Below the farmers are artisans, because and they exist basically to support farmers because it's hard to farm without tools. And at the very bottom were merchants. Right, so in their social status system, merchants were at the very bottom because they weren't seen as producing anything productive. We need scholar officials to govern and organize society. We need farmers to feed us. We need artisans to help the officials and farmers do their jobs. But what do merchants do? Merchants make money by getting you to buy things you don't need and by marking up prices as high as possible. Now, that's unfair to merchants. Actually, merchants perform an important job because they move things from places of high supply to places of high demand, right? Merchants are actually very important. But the Qing dynasty saw merchants as basically untrustworthy people who made money by convincing you to buy things you don't need, and as people who didn't really produce anything for society. So they tended to discourage trade. And you can see this in the fact, or rather I should say two facts. The first fact is that Qing China limited Europeans and then later Americans to trading in the port of Guangzhou. So if you look to the far south of this map, you can see Guangzhou. Right? There's a little arrow to kind of point that out to you. The capital was in Beijing, and there's another little arrow to show you that. So you'll note that they and this is the only place that you could legally come to trade if you were European or an American. You can see that they wanted to keep you as far away from the political center of China as possible. Right? You're down there in Guangzhou trading. You're far from Beijing. That will limit foreign influence. That's the idea. These foreigners are dangerous. They bring in instability. We don't like merchants to begin with, but we sure as heck don't want foreign merchants coming here bringing their strange ideas and their barbaric ways because, hey, they don't follow Confucianism. So there's this idea that trade is bad and that foreign trade is especially bad, but we kind of got to put up with it because if we don't trade with these foreigners, they'll become pirates and attack us and such. So we better just have some limited trade with them, put them as far away from Beijing as possible. Now here's a zoomed in map to show us Guangzhou, called Canton at the time. It's often used interchangeably, but just for our purposes, Canton and Guangzhou are the same thing. And there's something called the Canton system. And foreign merchants were expected to come to trade, like I said, in this area in Guangzhou Canton, and they really didn't like it. They were very frustrated with it because they didn't like the fact that they could only trade one place. They'd like to trade in other places as well. The more ports open, the more money they could possibly make. But also the whole system was not based around free trade. The whole system was based around, in a sense, discouraging trade. So, for example, if you wanted to trade here, you had to give a whole bunch of gifts and pay a whole bunch of money to the local officials. And this often was not clear. It was not technically legal, but you were expected to pay bribes, essentially. And a lot of Western merchants didn't like this. They believed in free trade. They thought the more trade, the better. They didn't like all this bureaucracy. They wanted to trade as much as possible. And even though there were some Chinese merchants who would love to have traded more with them, the Qing government did not like this. So there was this basic kind of frustration felt by the Western merchants who were forced in this little area far away from Beijing to trade. And I just want to highlight, you'll notice in the southeast of that square, there's a place called Hong Kong that will later come under British control, so that the British will have more access to this trade. Now, There is, though, some profitable partnerships. A lot of times the British, other Westerners, and the Americans will get along well with individual Chinese merchants. They'll often form very close relationships. To give you an example, there's a case, I think he was actually an American merchant, where some ships he'd invested in sank, and he was going to go bankrupt. And the Chinese merchants that he was connected with not only canceled the debts that he owed them, they gave him more money so he could restart his business, right? These Chinese merchants understood the importance of finding trustworthy trade partners and supporting them. And so you could have very deep and very close relationships with the Chinese. And this is an example of a Chinese a person who admires the West and has asked to be painted in a Western style. However, there is a problem, particularly for the British. We're going to focus on the British. The Chinese aren't that interested in a lot of British goods. The British want Chinese tea, right? They really want Chinese tea. They're spending huge amounts of money on Chinese tea. The average British person spends something like 5% of their income on tea each month. But the problem is there's just not a whole lot that the British have that the Chinese want other than silver. And that's not a good idea to be trading silver for tea, right? Tea, you can just grow more every year, but silver, there's only a limited amount. So Britain will start looking to India, which is their colony, and the production and sale of opium. And the British will sell opium to Chinese smugglers. They will also smuggle opium directly into China, into Guangdong, into Canton, like we were just talking about. And there's Chinese people who help with this. And China is extraordinarily upset about this. The government's not happy about this because now they're the ones who are losing silver. And they increasingly have a drug-addicted population. And you know how the United States currently is following this or suffering from this kind of crystal meth scourge. And this hurts, you think about the poor kids, the meth addicts and the crimes that they commit and the human suffering that they endure and that they may inflict on others. That's going on in China right now. And China's losing a huge amount of money over it. So the Chinese government does something that seems very reasonable to them. The use of opium for anything but medicinal purposes is outlawed. And so the British and the other people, and there are Americans who participate in this trade, I'm just focusing on the British, they're breaking the law. And so China's solution is to send a man named Lin Zexu down to Canton to deal with the problem. And he starts arresting addicts, forcing them to go through rehabilitation. He also blockades the British community and refuses to let them have food until the opium is surrendered. The opium is eventually given up, and then he has it destroyed. And this guy today is a major hero in China. And in the time period, Lin Zexu thought, well, this is it. That's that. I've destroyed the opium, taught the foreigners a lesson. This is all we're going to hear of it. However, that is not the end of things. The British government is unhappy about this, especially because the British representative had promised that the British, or had told the British merchants, go ahead and surrender your opium because the British government will pay you back. And the British government had no intention of paying back the money itself. It planned on making the Chinese pay it back. So from the British perspective, there were many British people, I should point out, who didn't like this war, who thought the Chinese were right to destroy these pernicious drugs. But in those people, a lot of whom were Christian missionaries working in China, they lose in the political struggle in Britain, and Britain decides to make war on China. And because of the time period, it actually took a while for the British to actually get over to China, and until about 1840, the year actually, the war really begins, because that's when the British fleet gets there. And the thing about the Opium War between the British and the Qing China is how easily the British win. The British are armed with relatively modern weapons. They also have steamships, and you'll notice if you look closely at that map that you can see there's little ships everywhere, and that represents how the British ships were able to go around and attack these different ports. You'll notice that one actually goes inland. That's because it was able to steam up a river. And so you had these powerful British ships who could go up Chinese rivers or along the Chinese coast and just blow the heck out of any Chinese city and any Chinese army. And so the British do not lose a single major battle. There's one skirmish that they kind of lose, but it involves like a couple hundred people, so it's not a big deal. Every major battle, the British easily win. And they're able to force China to sign the first of the so-called unequal treaties, beginning what is called China's Century of Humiliation. Now, there's lots of different things that these treaties involve. But I want to first of all stress what we mean by unequal treaty. It's a treaty that gave the British people certain rights in China that Chinese people did not get in Britain. So it's not a treaty that binds together two equals. It's a treaty that basically makes oppressing another country legal, if that makes sense, right? The British have certain rights in China that the Chinese don't have in Britain. So first of all, according to this unequal treaty, the Chinese have to spend a huge amount of money paying the British off. They have to pay the British a huge amount of money, called an indemnity, right? An indemnity is money you have to pay when you lose a war. They also have to cede Britain Hong Kong, though not permanently. It's just for a lease, essentially. It gets very complex with the history of Hong Kong, but this will become essentially a British colony in China. The Chinese are also forced to open more ports so that you can trade in other places other than Guangzhou Canton. And British have what's called extraterritoriality, which means that they can come into China, and if they commit a crime or are accused of committing a crime, they will not be tried and punished according to Chinese law. They'll be tried and punished according to British law. And in one sense, this does represent inequality because it's basically saying British law is superior to Chinese law. I should point out Chinese people who went to Britain would be tried under British law, not Chinese law. But we can kind of also understand the British because, for example, in Chinese judicial cases, torture was regularly used, whereas the British forbade the use of torture in this time period. And to give another example, in Britain, if you intentionally killed someone, you were punished for murder. But if you unintentionally killed someone, you would receive a lesser punishment. In Chinese law, they really didn't care whether they didn't make such a strong distinction. So the laws were often carried out more, more strongly in China than in Britain. In addition, and this will be very important later on, the British will get the right will get the right to conduct missionary work in China. Opium is not mentioned, so opium remains illegal, but the British are basically, and other countries too, like I said, Americans get involved in this, are able to bring in opium and sell it as they please, effectively, even though it's still technically illegal. Other countries will quickly also get treaties with China and will enjoy these same rights. Now, one thing you may ask yourself then is, well, how does China react to all this, right? They just got beaten in a war in which they didn't lose any, or in which they didn't win any major battles. Doesn't this lead to them saying, hey, we need to reform? Well, the answer is no, right? There is no kind of drive to reform at this point. China reacts by trying to avoid honoring the treaties where possible. There'll be continued British frustration that the Chinese, for example, are very slow in actually opening the ports. And part of this has to do with the Chinese experience, why they don't instantly start reforming. You would think they would at least buy, a bunch more steamships or something. Well, first of all, they didn't really understand just how powerful Western countries were, right? They just didn't understand how strong they were. Moreover, China had never been really threatened that much from overseas. Their major threats had always come from the north, from people like the Mongols or the Manchus. So they saw the British more as pirates, as people who might come in and raid and attack you, and you can pay them off and they'll leave. So they didn't really see them as that much of a threat. They believed the traditional threat were the people in the north, people like the Mongols and the Manchus and so forth. Of course, now the Ching are Manchus, but the key thing is in the Chinese historical experience, people from the ocean did not directly threaten the dynasty. And we also have to understand, remember, the system that governs China had been working for a couple thousand years by this time. And not only was it seen as practical, it was just seen as cosmically right and good. You don't change the system because this resonates with the cosmos itself. So you're not just going to throw out all this tradition that had worked so well for so long just because you lose one war against people you just see as pirates. And we're going to get to Japan in the next, in a later section, but we have to really emphasize here that Japan is going to react very differently. It's going to learn from China's mistakes. It's going to have some benefits because it's not going to be facing pressure as early as China. But for now, we just want to emphasize that China and Japan will react very differently. So remember, I had talked about how China is going to face domestic problems and foreign problems at the same time. We started with the domestic problems in terms of a growing lack of resources, especially food, and how that was leading to problems. And remember, I said it's only one step away from becoming bandits to being rebels. And then now we've also talked about this kind of growing international influence in China and the foreign pressure on China to change how it was doing things. So and this is going to lead to what we call the Taiping Rebellion. Now, what happens is remember, the ports are now open. Additional ports are open, I should say. And also, there are now going to be missionaries in those ports. Now, Christianity had been in China before, but before this period, it had been illegal. But now you're going to have these missionaries in treaty ports. And there is a man named Hong Xiuquan. Interestingly enough, he's Hakka. He's one of the ethnic minorities who wants to become a scholar, who wants to become an official. And poor Hong Xiuquan had like the worst case of test anxiety ever. He kept taking and failing the exams. He took and failed the exams multiple times. Once, when he was in a treaty port to take an exam, right? The treaty ports were places where lots of people lived. They were regional centers, so oftentimes an exam was held there. He received a series of tracts from a missionary, and these are like little pamphlets explaining what Christianity is. He took the tracts, put them in his bag, and went and failed the exam, went home and had a nervous breakdown. And he was basically in this kind of semi-comatose state for several weeks, and he had a series of visions. And I had once tried to draw what these visions looked like. My, at the time, 11-year-old son looked at them and laughed and offered to draw them for me, and you can see them on the right side. In these visions, Hong saw a man with a beard who said he was Hong's father. He also saw a younger man, younger than his father, but older than him, who was identified as his brother. He's not pictured in my son's drawing. And he also saw Confucius. The old man was yelling at Confucius, and Confucius was crying and upset because the old man was yelling at him, in my son's drawing, not in real life. And Hong was also given a sword and told to kill demons. So Hong explained all this to his cousin, who had helped take care of Hong while he was having these visions / dreams, whatever you want to call them, hallucinations. His cousin said, "Actually, Hong, I think I understand these. You should read this book that the missionary gave you. You should read this, or this tract the missionary gave you." And Hong read the tract, and he said, "Oh, the old man with the beard was God the Father. And the younger man was Jesus Christ, God's Son. And God the Father identified Jesus Christ as my older brother. Therefore, I am the Son of God, another Son of God, a Chinese Son of God." Right? So he became convinced that he was the Son of God and the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And in his dream, remember, Confucius was upset because the old man was criticizing him. And so Hong says, "Oh, I need to attack Confucianism. Confucianism is bad." And of course, it was easy to convince Hong that Confucianism was bad because he kept failing the exams that were based on the readings of Confucius. So of course now he hated Confucius. And he had been given a sword and told to attack demons, which he will later identify as the Manchu. So this is going to lead to a major rebellion, right? This is going to lead to a major rebellion in China, the Taiping Rebellion. And Taiping, by the way, means great peace. It was not peaceful at all. Will lead from 1850 to 1864. So basically, Hong Xiuquan will, after having this religious experience, will start spreading his ideas. He will also try and put them into practice by doing things like destroying ancestor tablets in Confucian temples. He will see those as kind of idolatrous, as against God. And he also is living in a time of social disorder. Remember, we were talking about that previously, a time of crime and of banditry. So he and some of the people he will convert, and most of the people he converts are Hakka. Remember, that's his ethnic group. They will form a kind of religious militia. And Qing troops will eventually show up and say, hey, you guys need to disband your militia. And the militia's response, Hong's militia's response is, well, you guys will leave and then the bandits will come back. So we don't want to disband the militia. And the Qing say, oh no, you're going to disband this militia. And the Hong and the militia say, no, we're not going to. Or actually, I should say the militia did it. Hong was away at this time. And what will happen is the militia will end up fighting with the Qing troops and win. So, this basically, you have this, this is why the Chinese were concerned about keeping out foreign influence, right? You've got this foreign religion, Christianity, influencing Hong Xiuquan, leads him to take action that's kind of destabilizing, right? He's going around spreading his ideas and attacking temples. He forms a militia, and then that militia will fight with Qing troops. And now that initial success convinces them that God wants them to rise up in rebellion. They declare a new dynasty, Taiping, right? Great peace. We call it the Taiping Rebellion. It's not that they thought the rebellion was peaceful. It's they were trying to establish a world, a new dynasty of great peace. And Hong will look at the Chinese emperor, who's a Manchu, and say, aha, this Confucian guy is a demon. These Manchus are demons. And whenever Hong and his troops will take a city, they will specifically go out and find the Manchus and massacre them because they see them as literally demonic. And this rebellion is so successful that they actually seize the city of Nanjing. You've probably heard of Beijing. That means northern capital. That was the capital of Qing China. Nanjing means southern capital. It was the old capital. So they actually seize the old capital of China. And if you look at this map, you can see that they seize a large chunk of China, right? They see something like a 20% or so of China. But what's really important for us to understand is this part of China is some of the wealthiest areas in China. So this is a really serious rebellion. It will last a long time and occupy a huge amount of China, all while China is already having a lot of problems as it stands. Now, as this rebellion is going on, of course, Western people learn about it, and some of them are really interested in it. They like the idea of a new Christian dynasty ruling China, but they quickly learn that Hong's Christianity is rather unorthodox. I mean, he does claim to be the younger brother of Jesus, to be a second son of God. And when they show Hong in the Bible where it says, well, Jesus is the only son, he'll say, well, the Bible's wrong. So you can see that Western Christians were not a big fan of that. And they were also concerned, not simply about the religious orthodoxy, but they realized that if he won, he would probably establish a new strong dynasty. And they decided that they would prefer a weak dynasty that they could control, right? Keep the Chinese government around, keep the Qing around, and have them accept all these unequal treaties, keep them weak, so we can kind of do what we want in China. And so Westerners will actually help the Qing put down this rebellion. That's one of them on the right there. That's actually a Western person dressed in Chinese clothing. Charles Chinese Gordon, a very important British general who will help. And what will happen is the rebellion will be put down, but 20 million people will die. That's twice in World War I. If you include civilian casualties, the number is usually given as 15 million. Here it's about 20. And it doesn't really resolve anything. We'll compare this later with the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which is a short war that doesn't kill many people and that is going to bring together a new powerful government. Taiping Rebellion just kills a bunch of people. It doesn't really help China, right? If the rebellion had been put down quickly or had never happened, the Qing would have been stronger. If the rebellion would have succeeded, it would have brought together a more powerful dynasty that could have helped, reform China and make it strong. Instead, they get the worst of both worlds. The rebellion lasts a long time, kills a lot of people, doesn't really resolve anything. And I want to stress, this is one of multiple rebellions that the government faces, the Qing government faces, and they have to fight a second Opium War between 1856 and 1860 with the British and the French. The British and the French win the Opium War, force the Qing dynasty to accept a bunch of treaties, or to accept a treaty that gives them even more power, and that's why they're willing to support the Qing against the Taiping, and then they help end it. So think about it. The Qing government is so weak now that it needs help from foreigners to put down a rebellion. right? The Qing are really having a hard time. Now, what's striking, though, is that it's at this point that more Chinese say, we need reform. It's in direct reaction to the Taiping Rebellion that more Chinese say, we want change, we want reform. An important reformer is a man named Zheng Guofan. Right, Zheng Guofan. Zheng Guofan was a Confucian scholar and an incorruptible official. He was the real deal. He was the ideal of how a scholar official should behave, right? I mean, this guy, I'm not kidding, in a time when many people were corrupt, when there were lots of problems, this guy really believed in Confucianism and really put the Chinese empire and the Confucian civilization it represented first, above his own interest. And he will raise an army to fight against the Taiping Rebellion. And I want to stress, this isn't like the regular army. The regular army was by this time pretty much useless. So the Chinese government, the Qing government, actually allowed him to raise taxes to like build his own army. So that's kind of scary. Imagine if there was like, a major rebellion that was occupying the South, and the president of the United States was like, well, our army's not very good. I'm going to give the governors in the South the power to levy additional taxes to make an army. Now that works as long as the governors are fine and honest, and Zheng Guofan himself was fine and honest. But this is a major ceding of central government authority to the provinces, to the local areas, right? This local guy, Zheng Guofan, is allowed to raise taxes, to levy his own taxes to support an army, because the Qing army is so terrible by this time, it's useless to help put down the Taiping. That works for people like Zheng Guofan who are loyal. But later, people will not be loyal to the Qing, but will still be raising their own armies. Zheng Guofan was interested in making China stronger. He thought China could be made stronger by studying things like foreign languages, like mathematics and science. So he was open to learning from the West. And he specifically focused on those things because they would allow you, if you could read foreign languages, if you understood math and science, you could build factories and make guns. So Zheng Guofan is an example of what we call self-strengthening. He did not want major political or social changes. He did not want major economic changes. He wanted China to basically stay the same, but learn how to make guns, right? Many Chinese understood that military technology had made the West very powerful, and so they wanted to adopt that military technology and just enough of the scientific and industrial revolutions in order to support that military. That was it. They are basically engaging in a kind of conservative reform. And as I mentioned, we call that conservative reform self-strengthening, right? Self-strengthening. And you can see that idea in this picture. I love this picture, and I show it all the time because I think it encapsulates that idea perfectly. You can see those men wearing traditional Chinese, Qing, Manchu uniforms, but they have modern Western technology. And it's very important in this time period, the clothes you wear say something about who you are politically, socially, and in terms of reform. So when you wear traditional clothing, that is sending a signal that you believe in the old ways. You either don't want any reform or you just want this kind of self-strengthening, limited, conservative reform. Now, why did the Chinese accept such limited reform? Why weren't they willing to go as far as the Japanese did? In the next section we'll be talking, or in a later section we'll talk more about the Japanese. Well, we have to remember, the Qing dynasty ruled by the idea of the concept of the mandate of heaven, right? The Qing dynasty ruled based on this concept of the mandate of heaven. That means they can't really accept nationalism, right? Nationalism has this idea that each nation should have its own state. The nation is defined typically ethnically. But there's a problem here because the Han Chinese and the Manchu are different ethnic groups. So the Qing dynasty engages in political reform that encourages nationalism, which had happened in places like Britain and France and helped make them powerful. That would lead to a problem because the Han Chinese would say, yeah, we like nationalism. Maybe we should be governed by Han Chinese and not by Manchu. So if the Qing dynasty, it would make sense for them to engage in political reform that would encourage nationalism because it makes you stronger, as we've discussed before. But the problem is, doing so would lead the Han Chinese to say, yeah, let's get rid of the Manchu. Let's get rid of them. We don't want them. In addition, they cannot encourage democracy because they were not elected. Right? The Qing dynasty conquered China and then claimed we have the mandate of heaven. If you accept democracy, people will point out, well, we never voted for you. And if there was an election, there's always a chance the Qing would lose. The Manchus would lose. So the Qing do not want to have major reforms in terms of nationalism or democracy or any kind of major political reform because it goes against their ruling ideology. They rule by the mandate of heaven. If they start accepting nationalism and democracy, that could easily lead to their overthrow. So you might say, well, wait a second. Why do the Chinese support the Manchu then? Right? Why would these scholar officials like Zheng Guofan be so loyal? Well, we have to stress there's going to be kind of an allegiance between the Qing Empire and the Confucian elite. And by the Confucian elite, I mean those people who are scholars, particularly ones who become scholar officials. They are going to be key supporters like Zheng Guofan. He's an illustrative example of this, who will support the Qing, because the Qing have embraced Confucianism. So remember, for many Chinese people like Zheng Guofan, and even local elites, remember, if you pass the exams, you get to wear special robes that say that you have passed the exams and that you're a special person, that you have certain rights, and people should take you seriously because you're educated and the government has recognized that. So here's the thing. If you're a government official on top, or if you're just some guy who passed the first exam, your prestige, your place in society comes from passing the exams, which themselves focused on moral knowledge based on Confucianism. So your power comes from Confucianism. Your status in society comes from Confucianism. And the importance of which is certified by the government, particularly the fact that the government will only accept people, or generally only accepts people to be government officials who pass those Confucian exams. But becoming like the West would demand emphasizing technical knowledge, not moral knowledge. So if we change, if we reform and say, okay, now we're going to emphasize technical knowledge more, and we're going to pick government officials based on their mastery of technical knowledge, that hurts you. You're saying now Confucian knowledge isn't important, Western knowledge is important, and we should respect and promote people based on their mastery of Western knowledge. If your position in society was based on your knowledge of Confucianism, that hurts you. If you're a student who's been spending a decade or more preparing to take the Confucian exams, you're like, oh, geez, don't change the material on the exam on me. I just learned this stuff. So many Chinese, especially among the Confucian elite, actually reject political reform. And they support the Qing because the Qing authorizes Confucianism, emphasizes and legitimizes their rule through Confucianism. And this means that anyone with Confucian knowledge who's passed the exams, even just the first one, has a certain position in society. Moreover, I don't want to sound so cynical, it's not simply about power or prestige. Remember, there's this Chinese idea that we are the center of civilization. And that civilization is the same as morality and it's cosmically right. So of course they're going to reject, people who think that idea is going to reject Western civilization. This stuff is foreign. It's therefore uncivilized. It's therefore barbaric. It's therefore immoral. And one thing I have to stress, we had the benefit of hindsight. We know what's going to happen. If you don't know what happens, don't worry. This class will tell you what happens next. We know that this whole system is going to fall apart in a few decades. But it had worked so well for so long. For almost 2,000 years, this system had worked. Why would you think that it was just going to fall apart in just a few decades? You likely wouldn't think that. So how can you get rid of a system that gives you a place in society, that legitimates your power in society, that you think is right and good and true, and that had worked so well for so long? No way you're going to give that up just because you lose a war or just because you're having a hard time now. And so that's why people like Zheng Guofan will emphasize, we just need the technology. The system is basically good. We just need to catch up, technically speaking. And people like him, the Confucian elite, will ally with the Qing and they will therefore avoid major changes. This makes a lot of sense. We can understand why people did this. It's going to turn out not to be the best policy for China. But one thing we have to emphasize, we had the benefit of hindsight. It's so easy to forget that we know what's going to happen. But I include here this picture of the Dingyuan. The Dingyuan was a battleship that the Chinese had purchased from the Germans. Very advanced battleship, very well built. And this is an important symbol that China was still powerful, and that many people accepted Chinese power. Right? This is going to be produced. I believe the Chinese receive it in 1885. So China, in the eyes of many, was reforming successfully. Right? To many people, this self-strengthening thing seemed to be working. Look at our new battleship. Now, it's true the Germans built it, but it doesn't really matter who built it because we know how to operate it, we know how to use it, and we're going to use it to project our power. So I want us I really have to emphasize this. In hindsight, we know that this isn't going to work. We know that self-strengthening is not going to work, but people at the time didn't know it. And it looked like China was successfully adopting its ancient traditions to modern technology, preserving much of the old while strengthening it by purchasing and then also building where it could its own weapons and ammunition and so forth. So as we end this section, I really have to emphasize that China, despite its problems, there are many people who are optimistic about China and who see it as a growing power in Asia that needs to be taken very seriously.